It seems to be sort of paradoxical that the left has become, in that sense, conservative. It believes in the state and expanding the state. So there's some truth that the right is more rebellious. One of the great paradoxes, this kind of right-wing populism, to what extent it rails against corporations and the mainstream media. How did that happen? It's clear that the left itself has become more conservative. I mean, it is part of a liberal establishment, and real opposition to that doesn't exist on the left. It exists, at least in ideology, on the right. How did that come about?
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le boonga, boonga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le boonga, boonga, Stockholm ou Monaco, ou Montevideo, Oslo, Tokyo, on fait le boonga, boonga.
Hello, welcome to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history, with Philip Cunliffe. Hello.
Hi.
George Hoare.
Hey.
And myself, Alex Hochuli, in São Paulo, Brazil. All the other two guys are over in the UK. So on this episode, you'll hear that I had the opportunity to speak with someone who I was delighted to get onto the podcast, Russell Jacoby. For those unfamiliar, he's professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, one of the leading lights of the New Left, and one of the sharpest historians of ideas of the past 50 years. Personally, he's someone who, since I first read him, was always struck by how sharp his critiques were, how courageous they were, and how unstinting they were. Particularly the end of Utopia, which I read back in my early 20s, and which really struck me for displaying how one could be totally thoroughgoing in critiquing contemporary ideas, which I kind of felt were not very good, pretty limited, not particularly inspiring, but actually critique them and demonstrate that they were complicit with the way things were, and the way things were was a state of affairs that should be overthrown. The way he provided the intellectual resources to do that, at least intellectually, has always stuck with me. So I was delighted to be able to speak with him today. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of his books, if you're not familiar, his first was Social Amnesia, a critique of contemporary psychology, which came out in 1975. I'm not going to cover all the books, but just to mention another one which treaded similar terrain, The Repression of Psychoanalysis, Otto Fenichel and the Political Freudians from 1983. Also in the early 80s, he published Dialectic of Defeat, Contours of Western Marxism, and moved on then to turn his gaze towards intellectual culture, a particularly arid intellectual culture towards the end of the Cold War and the post-Cold War era. In that vein, he published The Last Intellectuals, American Culture in the Age of Academe in 1987, and it was republished in 2000. Also, Dogmatic Wisdom, How the Culture Wars Divert Education and Distract America. And throughout that, he was always mounted a forthright defense of the critic and the role of utopian thought in social criticism. He developed those ideas then in The End of Utopia, Politics and Culture in an Age of Apathy, which came out in 1999, and then Picture Imperfect, Utopian Thought for an Anti-Utopian Age, which came out in 2005. And then finally, most recently, On Diversity, The Eclipse of the Individual in a Global Era. And it's some of those themes, psychoanalysis, the end of utopia, and diversity, that I spoke about with Russell Jacoby in the interview. George, Phil, you guys are also, I think, fans of his work or have read some of them. Anything that stands out to you?
Yeah, both. I mean, End of Utopia and The Last Intellectuals were both influential on me when I read them in the early 2000s or so. And particularly the End of Intellectuals, because that was also a time that I was, deciding whether or not to become an academic. And I remember what particularly struck me about it was how he, and this goes to your point, Alex, what was impressive about Jacoby was that he criticized even those figures that seemed to break the mold. like Camille Paglia, who had kind of cut her cloth as a kind of iconoclastic academic, and she seemed to be, kind of to be a genuine public figure and a genuine public intellectual, but she wasn't spared his criticism in that book either. And anyway, so an influential thinker in my thought as well.
Yeah, uncompromising, definitely. End of Utopia and Dialectic of Defeat are two that I remember reading a little while ago now. And yeah, just willing to criticize. I think, Phil put it well, even the things that, you think are against the exceptions. No, these are the things that, in true dialectical fashion, they kind of prove the rule. So yeah, I mean, you listed some of those books there. There's obviously absolutely loads, and loads of things that would be good to talk to him about.
Yeah, I mean, and books packed with ideas, stuff that you really have to kind of take a note on as you go along, incredibly wide ranging and deeply read, if you can say that. Also, I think, I mentioned kind of courageous, at least for me personally, it provided me with, I guess, the courage to, this will sound cliche and it'll sound really naff, but, dream big. Because basically he kind of goes, if intellectuals aren't going to hold on to big ideas, to imagine different futures, to be somewhat utopian in thought, even if the concrete nature of that utopia isn't spelled out, it's not about blueprints, but, some sort of better, grander future. If someone who's thinking and writing isn't going to do that, then who else is?
Picture the scene, reader. What Alex was like in his early 20s as a naive. Back then, he was actually good looking as well. And in his early 20s at LSE, and he was dreaming big about intellectuals and being an intellectual, and he was starry eyed about Russell Jacoby. Cast your mind back, listeners.
Not exactly a correct portrait, and not least because Phil didn't actually know me back then when I was an undergrad.
Mid 20s then.
But no, I think dream big is, yeah, I can kind of see how you could get that. It's kind of the fridge magnet summary of
Right.
the thought. But no, I mean that's it, right? What is the place of utopian thinking today? What's it been historically? Yeah, and I think that's a an important question, definitely.
All right. So what you're going to hear now in my conversation with Russell Jacoby is us covering a series of themes. So we start off looking back at Russell Jacoby's oeuvre as a whole, and also look at why he started firstly with a critique of psychology, of what he calls conformist psychology. Then we spent quite a bit of time talking about utopia. What is utopian thought? Is there utopian thought today? Is it all dystopian? What's the basis of dystopianism today? Before we move on to talk about his recent book on diversity, which, as you'll discover, and as I discovered when I read the book, isn't so much about diversity, but is about individualism, and specifically individuality, and why the kind of strong, robust individual who is imaginative and is able to sustain themselves no longer seems to exist, and what Jacoby's account is of that. And then we conclude by discussing some kind of contemporary themes that arise from our preceding discussion, and talk about the kind of scrambled intellectual and ideological coordinates of today, where you have a seemingly conservative left and radical right, and what to do about that. How do we act in this age, and how do we think grandly, think utopianly in this era? So, as is usually the case, the first half of the interview will be available to you all in this episode that you're currently listening to. But if you want the rest of it, you will have to sign up at patreon.com/bungacast. We'd love to have you there. $5 subscribers get at least 2 original episodes a month, including extended interviews like this one, dedicated episodes where the three of us analyze in depth present history, the affairs of the moment, and try to ask the deeper questions which aren't asked elsewhere, as well as our responses and regular discussions with patrons in response to our lively message board. And for $10 a month, you get all that plus access to our monthly reading club. This year, in the 2023 syllabus, we're going through 3 big themes: freedom, legitimacy, and globalization. All very much to the point, all very 2023, I'm sure you'll agree. We're actually in the final phases of going through that first section on freedom, discussing Martin Heglin's stupendous book, This Life, which tries to provide us with a new grounding for freedom based on how we manage our time, how we use our scarce time, and how taking charge of that might actually set us free. In doing all this, what we're trying to do is find the intellectual resources to break through our contemporary impasse that we call the end of history. So anyway, that's all at patreon.com/bungacast. We hope to see you there. We'd love to have you. Other than subscribing, if you don't already follow us, we're at Bungacast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on social media. And if you like what you hear, remember to review us, give us some stars. Nice one. Okay, here's my interview with Russell Jacoby. All right, Russell, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start by discussing your upbringing. You were 15 in 1960 and 20 in 1965, if I'm not mistaken. And you were brought up in a Jewish milieu in New York that was liberal and perhaps radical. I don't know if you would describe it as such. But I mean, I'm assuming that politics wasn't something that necessarily you had to actively choose to be interested in, but was interested in you. So I wonder what ideas animated you back then when you were 15, 20, something like that, or whose ideas kind of animated you at that time?
Well, I mean, I think I was probably a fairly typical representative of a part of the 60s generation. Yes, I came from a family which was political. The phrase of being a red diaper baby, I don't think is totally accurate in my case, but maybe I was a pink diaper baby. That is, my family was on the left, and most of their friends were on the left as well. So I think I came into that world with a particular orientation. And it was a world which, as one knows, was changing rapidly. I mean, there was the anti-nuclear movement. There was the anti-racism or anti-segregation, the civil rights movement, and then looming up was the Vietnam War. So all those became issues as I was in high school, and then as I went to college, and that becomes certainly the context for not only me but for many of my generation. But I did come from a leftist family, so it was not all news to me.
Right.
So when I went to college, Vietnam War, the end of the war, the civil rights movement, these were the issues of the day, and and they remain the issues in college for the next 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years.
Right, and I mean, I guess the impulse to critique society came fairly naturally as a consequence. But it was something that, rereading your work throughout it, you seem to tacitly or sometimes explicitly defend the role of the social critic. And I think today the social critic is not only a rare figure, but also a pretty unpopular one. It's like being a pundit, except worse, maybe more cantankerous and more aloof. And I think probably compared to a pundit, the social critic might not as easily bow down in front of the orthodoxies of the day, but at the same time would be dismissed as someone pontificating from their ivory tower or their armchair, depending, I guess, on your metaphor. But across your work, you come across pretty forthright about not only the necessity, but also the duty of the social critic, and the duty maybe to be a critic, at least for those who see themselves as intellectuals, or maybe those who don't see themselves as intellectuals, but nevertheless form part of the intellectual caste. So I wanted to ask you how you understand this, and whether you indeed do see it as a duty to be a social critic.
The duty to be a social critic. I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I'm sometimes tempted. I mean, I think, yes, the short answer is yes. But I think, half the professorial class sees themselves as critics at this point. And I've been tempted to, at some point, I don't know if Marx ever said, though it was attributed to him at some point, the comment that all I know is that I'm not a Marxist. something that Marx, maybe he once said that. And in some ways, I also would say, all I know is I'm not a critical theorist because,
Right.
Because critical theory, has become so inflated and so vast. And that's, is that the social critic today, the critical theorist? Everyone's a critical theorist. We have critical everything. We have critical, race theory. We have critical anthropology. We have critical sociology. So it's difficult to simply say what is the social critic today. Is it a critical theorist? Is it an academic? Is it someone who has a podcast? Is it someone, I've written in The Last Intellectual something about the necessity of critics to be able to command the vernacular, to enter the public world. And I continue to think that's important. And one of the things that I've talked about in that book and elsewhere is that, paradoxically, the right has been better than the left.
Yeah.
That the left actually has commanded critical theory, meaning academic theory, but is unable to command the public discourse in the same way that the right wing has. And I think that remains a problem. I mean, the social critic today tends to be a professor and speaks to students and colleagues and not to a public.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I mean, the obtuseness and opacity of the language, I guess, is something that's in sort of these sorts of criticisms. It's something that you always come back to. But I think it's right at the end of the day that that it's not spoken. These criticisms aren't made, or the kind of writing is opaque. It's not accessible, and it seems to be almost deliberately so. But what's interesting, I think, is that at the same time, this language, I think that the language of kind of whatever humanities academics or the postmodern academy has infiltrated a lot of public life now as well, in areas which are not formally within the academy, whether it's non-profits and the arts and media and so on. So I think that there's a weird thing there happening with the vernacular that you refer to, that in a way that weird critical theory language has become the vernacular, at least for certain sections of society.
Right. Well, I agree with that. And I don't think that's all, I'm not sure that's always progress, but yeah, I've written about that myself, and in what extent I would revise The Last Intellectuals, because in fact, some of that academic jargon, a lot of the identity politics, a lot of the multiculturals and diversity stuff is coming out of the university. And has infiltrated to the public sphere through students, basically. And I'm not sure that that's progress. I mean, it's also distorted politics in many ways. But it is true that I think that academic jargon, and again, I've said often, the leading American Marxists are basically only known in the university. I mean, who knows who Frederick Jameson is, apart from, literary critics, or Gayatri Spivak, or Omi Barbar. But it is true that, their students, in a certain sense, have gotten employment in the public world. And so some of that jargon has entered into the public sphere, and I'm not sure that's always a plus. I think it has damaged some public discourse.
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, this kind of pops into my head now, but talking about the way that this sorts of language and these sorts of ideas has filtered into the public sphere, whether the kind of opposition to that hasn't filtered into the public sphere as well. So the notion that you've criticized for a long time about the professionalization of intellectual thought, of intellectual life, and the whole role that the academy plays within it, that there seems to be maybe people coming around to your point of view, I guess. It's been popularized perhaps under the terms in which Peter Turchin talks about elite overproduction. That's something that I see kind of thrown about increasingly. So I wonder if there's some maybe light at the end of the tunnel, or a realization that academia might not be the best place from which to think.
Well, I think there's something to that. I mean, on one hand, the economics of the university have changed in the last 15 years, so that the employment has much diminished, so that younger critics or intellectuals can't easily find positions. So they have to make their way in the world, podcasts or subscriptions, or the university is no longer, at least for the humanities, so welcoming. I mean, just for pure economic reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So there is possibly. I mean, someone just sent me an article about the new younger critics who are not basically professors, or at least many of them weren't, and so one could say yes, there is a possibility there. There's an opening there as the universities contract, at least in the humanities, and we've seen this in the last decades. I mean, English departments, my history, they've all beginning to shrink. So this has forced would-be intellectuals, into the public world.
So I'm obviously trying to be a bit hopeful here, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about your ideas on utopia and your discussions of utopia. But before that, I wanted to roll back, I guess, to your very first book, Social Amnesia, which was published in 1975 and was a critique of what you called conformist psychology, which was looking at the post-Freudians and the neo-Freudians and critiquing them for abandoning, I guess, their master's radical insights. Now, the preface to that book was written by Christopher Lasch, who I think, if I'm not mistaken, supervised your doctoral thesis. Is that right?
Yes.
And so in that preface, he notes the dynamism of the times, but also remarks that it's rather perpetual motion without forward movement, and that, like commodities, thought as well seems to come kind of packaged up with planned obsolescence built in. And I wonder if we could maybe turn to the question of psychology in light of that, and I guess therapy talk, which is everywhere today, and it's whether it's conveyed by TikToks or Instagram reels concerned with mindfulness, or actually talking about kind of the forms of language spreading out from the academy and elsewhere, that the lexicon of corporate communications is also infected by therapy talk. And I wonder how, maybe looking back to that book, which I guess you were writing about 50 years ago, how you'd evaluate the advance of psychology in broad terms since writing that book.
Not a simple question. I mean, I don't really think I've changed my position. I mean, obviously, there have been enormous advances in psychology. I mean, certainly on the medical side, I mean, in terms of drugs and treatment, it tends to be symptomatic as opposed to analytic. I mean, if you're depressed, this is, we work on the chemistry of it. And I'm not one to say that that's something which should be discounted. On the other hand, it doesn't really go to the heart of the matter. I mean, why people are depressed, or what is wrong with society. And that was always my argument in Social Amnesia, that the psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic approach, therapeutically was hopeless. I mean, it was 5 years of analysis with limited results. But it was a very serious encounter with the structure of the individual, and with the interface between society and the individual ultimately. And many of the therapies that were appearing were much more superficial. Uh, we're quick therapies. How to feel better, how to do this, how to do that. Which again, if it works, it works. On the other hand, let us not kid ourselves. And I think I made the analogy even then, which I think is probably valid. I mean, if you're dealing with, occupational diseases, let's say black lung disease, and you're a medical doctor, you deal with the patient in front of you. You have a lung disease. This is the remedy for that. On the other hand, if we step back, the problem is the coal mines and the conditions in the mines. The two don't go together. And it seems very difficult for people to see that. That is the individual therapy, and what helps the individual is not necessarily the same as the analysis of what is the causation. And, that was part of my argument, theory and therapy. And we continue to conflate the two, now more than ever. What makes people feel better? What works?
Yeah.
Okay, but is that the problem?
Yeah, like low serotonin, you can treat that, and therefore low serotonin becomes the problem, for example, rather than anything deeper. And
yeah.
I mean, it really struck me, when I read that book, how I thought, can he do that? Which is to say, to defend Freudian theory, but basically say, well, the actual practice, the actual clinical practice may or may not work, but let's leave that to one side. The important thing is to defend the theory.
But Freud himself would say that. I think I in the book, he says, we promise everyday unhappiness. That was the promise of Freudian psychology, everyday unhappiness. Well, no one wants that. I mean, you can't open it, you can't put out your sign as a therapist and say, guess what? You can be as unhappy as everyone else. That was ridiculous. And it would take you 5 years to get there. So as a therapy, there's something else there too, which, I might mention, is that the clientele of the psychoanalytic world in those years, devoted so much time to introspection. These are people who, the classical psychoanalysis was every day for an hour for several years. And this is a society which wasn't as wealthy as ours. It's almost inconceivable. You say, go to therapy every day for an hour. These people were serious about looking into them, and now we're not so serious. We want something quicker. We want something faster.
Quickly consumable mental health. Yeah. So I wanted to turn to Utopia because it's two of your books which marked me quite a bit back when I read them in the mid 2000s. Which specifically are The End of Utopia, Politics and Culture in the Age of Apathy, which came out in 1999, and it was followed in 2005 by Picture Imperfect, Utopian Thought for an Anti-Utopian Age. So, and probably not just in these two books, but the notion of utopian thought and the role and duty of the critic, or whatever, as we've already discussed, is a thread that I think runs through a lot of your work. And as I was explaining to you before we started recording, that the premise of this podcast is how we're living through the end of history. And looking back, the first chapter in your book, The End of Utopia, is called The End of the End of the End of Ideology, which actually sounds like the way that many people mock this podcast sometimes by just going, oh, it's the end of the end of the end of history. But actually that chapter featured a very critical depiction of the way that all sides had given up on dreams of a better society. And I wonder what your take is now, if we were to fast forward 20 odd years since the publication of that book, and we have the post-Cold War era order breaking up, neoliberalism has lost its authority, even if it kind of still remains, and political turbulence in general is on the up. So it's something that we've talked about a lot on this podcast, is that, the end of history was characterized ultimately by apathy. The subtitle of your book is An Age of Apathy. And today it seems like, if there's one affect if we can be a bit kind of reductive about this, it's that characterizes things. It's anger. So I wonder, I mean, do you think, having looked at thought over the past century, and been very critical of thought during the end of history, or the absence of thought during the end of history, whether the kind of current breakdown that we're living through, this interregnum, might actually encourage some greater adventure in thought, and if you have if you have any evidence of that, or if you're just very gloomy.
I can't say I have much evidence of it. I mean, yes, I suppose it's fair to say we live in an age of anger and resentment. But which I think I've mentioned in passing in an interview. I mean, look at the strikes in France. People are angry about changing the age of retirement from 62 to 64. Well, again, I guess one could understand that. I mean, some of the people who are interviewed are students. They've never worked. What are they looking forward to? They're looking, they're fighting so they can retire at 62 as opposed to 64. And they're angry. And, but what is the vision that they have? I mean, it's a vision which is completely accepted the society they live in, and say, let's just get through this working life and, get on the other side of it. I mean, that's the hope. So it seems to me that's a pretty constricted vision, even though, again, one can understand the people who are on strike. But compared to the strikes of the 60s, where there were also labor unions on strike, you could say it was hopeless, but there was a whiff, a spirit that maybe the consumer society was irrational, that we were working, to produce abundance, and it wasn't making anyone happy. But that's gone. I mean, so the anger that you're referring to seems extremely limited. I mean, it's palpable, but it doesn't have a vision. It doesn't have a hope. And the retirement age is a perfect illustration. I mean, we want the status quo, 62. That's where we're fighting.
Yeah.
And Macron wants 64. I go, okay. I mean, that's the monumental issue of the day in France, and it is.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't want to generalize France everywhere, but I don't see much of a vision here. I mean, people have accepted we want control of the schools. We want, the homeless off the streets. There's certainly issues everywhere. But there's very little bit of, the utopian spirit or a vision of a different kind of life, the end of work. I mean, it's not even mentioned anymore. It's not, it's gone.
Yeah. So you said we want 62. It might actually be we want 1962, because I think both mainstream left and right are nostalgic for the Trente Glorieuses, or the post-war golden era, albeit different visions of it. But I think both left and right kind of at best have a kind of nostalgic longing for that.
Well, it's possible. The right for the 50s, the left for the 60s, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's right. Yeah. I don't know where the dividing line exactly is. Maybe 1962, maybe 1960, but yeah.
Right.
You mentioned the desire to retain the entirely justified desire to retain the age of retirement at 62 in France, but that the dream is resignation. And I've been tussling with this, and it's something that I've even called kind of provisionally kind of the utopia of resignation. And I think this is kind of one of the few sorts of utopias that we can see about in the sort of popular imaginary. And so it's not the dream of social transformation, but of retiring. I think you've commented something along these lines recently. And I think we can maybe see this in proposals probably for the the hottest new idea that there is out there. I'm skeptical, but for universal basic income, or indeed even just in the practice of people quitting their jobs, as you had in the so-called Great Resignation, maybe sometimes downsizing their lives and personal ambitions. So basically accepting it's not, a life of plenty, but actually a trade-off, right? So you have less money in exchange for a quieter, more dignified life. And I think that seems to be to the extent that a world without work, or a post-work vision, and this is fairly widely discussed on the left today. I think that is the extent of the ambition, it seems to me. But there's something interesting happening there. I don't know if you agree.
You mean with this idea of a guaranteed income as a...
Not specifically that as a policy proposal, but perhaps more broadly that there is thinking going on about work, about working less, about how we arrange and organize the world of work.
Well, I mean, to the extent I'm aware of it, which is not much, but I mean, sure. I mean, I think the questions of work and how to reorganize work, and maybe a guaranteed income, are ways to get at this issue, which seems to be so reified that we've largely accepted the consumer society and work as a way to keep it going. I mean, I think of Thomas More. I mean, utopia. I mean, the ending of it. He himself says, "Look, I mean, okay, everyone won't be wealthy, but you'll have security and a life without anxiety. And for your children and grandchildren." And it seems to me that is so crucial. I mean, we live in a world of such anxiety about our lives and our children and our grandchildren. So if there is a way to organize society with security, a guaranteed minimal income, a guaranteed for your children and grandchildren, sure. I mean, that's a way to smuggle in a utopian idea. But it is smuggling in. I mean, it was Marx's son-in-law, right, who writes the right to leisure. What is it?
Laziness, I think, right? Is that laziness? Is that right? The right to
laziness? Maybe something. And and he was criticizing some of the right to work laws. The sense that all we want to do is work, and maybe that is maybe there is a shift going on, because for a long time, particularly Americans, unlike the French, prided themselves on how long their work week was. We really, we work 50, 60, 78 hours. You're a top lawyer, you do 80-hour weeks. That's great, right? I mean, we work hard, we work long, we work hard, we play hard, we consume hard. Well, that's crazy. I mean, that's totally nuts. So if there's a way to chip away at that and say, that's a trinity which is disastrous. 80-hour work weeks, a lot of money, and a lot of consuming. That's disastrous.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I raise the issue because I'm also troubled by it, because for its sort of one-sidedness, because it does seem to be also a motivated by a certain, I don't know, dejection, a rejection of the, perhaps the busyness. I called it a utopia of resignation, kind of, of wanting to, bow out of the world of work, but not really attempting any form of social transformation. It's, to get your, to get your check from the state once a month, and then and live off of that while society kind of continues on. It's sort of uninterrupted. You're allowed to kind of bow out individually.
Right. I'm not disagreeing. I mean, I think utopia of resignation. I mean, it accepts the work world. There is no sense of fundamental reorganization, but where do we find that nowadays? I mean, where is that spirit? It's hard to find. I mean, it's not totally gone, but it's certainly it's at its weakest moment. The sense that there are some alternatives, and that the society, is on track for, is fundamentally destructive and irrational for all its, progress. It's irrational and destructive.
Yeah. I mean, and in this situation, it seems to me that one of the few motivating ideas left, it tends to be dystopianism, if you can call it that, or, certainly a kind of a politics of fear, which is practiced on all sides of the spectrum nowadays, and everybody has their preferred sort of emergency. I don't know if you can call them dystopias specifically, but I mean, I've been wondering about these sort of what you call regressive utopias, I guess. It's been discussed in those terms, particularly where I live in Brazil, with discussions of the rise of Bolsonaro, of the radical right, of growing evangelical Christianity, and apocalyptic sort of ideas of sort of, the only utopia that's left is a sort of regressive utopia. And I wonder what your take is on that, whether you kind of see that in the US, for example, whether you would see the US right as having some kind of, apocalyptic vision, or is it really more mundane than that, in terms of its, that it's just mundanely populist and nothing else?
Well, I'm a little reluctant, I mean, to expand the term utopia to include any, I don't know, any plan of any sort. I mean, I think historically, for whatever its weaknesses, it did have a vision of universal peace, of a certain kind of brotherhood, of a dismantling of a kind of a work economy. So when you spread it and say, well, there's various visions of post society, which, tend to be, I don't know what, insular or nationalist or even racist, and those are utopian. No, they're not utopian. They're something else. You're expanding utopia beyond its legitimate term. But sure, there are certainly plans out there. There's certainly visions of how to create society, but I wouldn't call them utopian. They are regressive, or they're violent, or but utopia has a tradition, and for whatever its flaws, and this is why I've always objected to calling Nazism utopian or something, because, well, if you have a vision of a racial state which kills people, that's utopian. I say, why is that utopia? I mean, what utopian writers have ever come up with that idea? You just don't find it. I mean, you can find things which you don't like in the utopian world. I mean, in terms of its setting forth certain rules. I mean, again, Thomas More, there was only, you couldn't wear clothes was very simple. You had but it wasn't violent. It wasn't destructive.
Yeah, it has to be at least a sort of nice idea to count as a utopia.
I mean, so why is Nazism utopian? But it's come to, people use it in those terms, so that we have utopians of various flavors. But I think at a certain point that's illegitimate.
Yeah, I mean, in the attempt to try to survey a little bit of what ideas are out there. So I've already kind of talked about universal basic income. On the right, or maybe just more generally, more popularly, there is maybe another sort of utopia, though I suspect you wouldn't agree on calling it utopia, but it's maybe the last kind of motivating idea, which is that of entrepreneurialism today, which I think if you look around, I think people might, and just ordinary people would have some vision of being their own boss, of setting up their own business, as that kind of hustle as providing a sort of way out, and that perhaps even a society in which everybody's doing that, however unrealistic that is, that itself constitutes some sort of vision of the future. And then you get the more worked up visions of this, which is, the Silicon Valley, big tech vision of utopia, or at the extreme, I guess, Peter Thiel's vision of, breakaway zones of, like a utopia of winners, of the guys who, the guys who made it and set up their own societies. I don't want to necessarily go that far, but I wonder what your take is on the kind of the culture of the entrepreneur today.
But why? I mean, isn't that the oldest idea as opposed to the newest? I mean, to open your own store, open your own restaurant. I mean, it's just it's a version of that, which you opt out of the rat race and you open your own shop somewhere, selling herbal tea, or a restaurant or something. I mean, I don't see it particularly as a new idea, and I'm not sure. I mean, unless you're talking about everyone setting up podcasts or
God forbid,
eBay stuff, or eBay stores or something. I mean, those are it's a version of an old. Yes, you could work from home and you can sell your crafts or something. I mean, good for you if you can do it. But what is new here? It's a version of something which immigrants and Americans always hoped. Set up your own store, set up your own business.
So do you think the prominence of that? Do you think the prominence of it then is more just the recession of other kind of more social visions that has left kind of entrepreneurialism as the only thing standing? Is that the way you'd see it?
Where do you see this most emphatically, this ethos of the entrepreneur?
Are you asking me? I mean,
yes,
I see it quite a lot. I mean, I'm drawing from my own experience, but here in Brazil, where workers will be quite proud of themselves as being an entrepreneur, a micro entrepreneur, whether it's just buying something in bulk and reselling it or becoming an Uber driver, and that there's a certain pride in that and the autonomy that they have, which is not just working for a boss, and all the way up to I'm going to make it rich with my idea.
Right. But this is, I mean, this is the lore of capitalism. It's always been. I mean, you could become your own independent worker, you could work for yourself. You could, and if it works, good. But I don't. It means you set up your own business, and if it gets successful, it's a bigger business, and you hire some people, and you become a larger business. And I mean, the attractiveness of that idea, it probably hasn't diminished. I mean, if you look at the streets, I mean, we have immigrants setting up little pop-up taco stands, or I mean, let's have our own business. And I think that's a path which can work, but we know where it leads. It just means, it's a society of independent business people, and some become more successful and many don't. But I don't see it as fundamentally, anything but an individual choice within the capitalist society.
So, I mean, I guess the individualism that's there, I mean, it's clearly an absence really of a social vision. I guess leads us on to your most recent book on diversity, the eclipse of the individual in a global era. And I was surprised by this book because it's not really a critique of diversity or diversity, equity, and inclusion, as maybe listeners might imagine, as I certainly imagined when I picked it up. And it's also not really a critique of kind of wokeness or cancel culture or these kinds of things, which I was expecting. And I was thinking, well, I'm pretty sure Russell Jacoby will do a really good job of critiquing that, but I don't know if I can be bothered to read another book on this. Having just read Norman Finkelstein's book, which is not to cast aspersions about that book, but I couldn't do with reading another book on that same topic just now. Anyway, it turns out that it's not really about that. It's actually about the fact that everyone talks up diversity these days, but that the world is becoming a lot less diverse, and that specifically individuals are less diverse than each other, and individuals seem to be less individual. So I wonder what prompted you to write this book. Was there some event, something you observed that made you feel, well, this is the thing that I need to critique, and this is the thing I need to defend right now?
Well, I don't know if there's any particular, one thing. I mean, but it's pretty clear if you travel the world at all, you can see to what extent the forces of, whatever you want to call it, Americanization, late capitalism, consumerism, spread. I mean, even the extent that young people look more and more alike. I mean, I go to France a lot. I mean, the French used to look different than Americans. I mean, they dress differently. And I used to argue with my partner that she would say, "Oh, the French will never adopt. They'll never wear athletic wear. They'll never wear sneakers. I mean, that's just American garbage, right?" Well, wrong, right? They all wear sneakers. They all wear blue jeans. I mean, you see this everywhere in some ways. That the forces of capitalism and consumerism, and here, Marx in the Communist Manifesto put it, they knock down the walls. I mean, it's just impossible to resist. And you see this, virtually everywhere. And it seems to me, I mean, it's just a paradox that, as the world becomes more homogenous, the ideology of diversity gains more and more, energy without any acknowledgement of the countervailing forces. That, we are becoming more and more a connected, homogenous world, which is not to say less violent, but at the same time, we have this ideology which is booming about we are more and more different. And again, I mean, I worked at the university. Well, again, we see, diversity, but, how diverse are people? People want the same things. They want to drive the same cars. They want to live in the same neighborhoods. What does it actually mean to say everyone is more and more different?
And how do you account for that paradox? I mean, do you think it's a sort of compensatory sort of mechanism whereby people talk up diversity to compensate for the lack of diversity?
Well, I think, in some sense, I do say that in that book and elsewhere, that in some sense, yes, that and I think it's certainly true in immigrant communities. And I mean, I be careful to generalize, but, it's pretty clear that immigrant communities in America, Polish, those older communities, Polish Americans, Italian Americans, they lose the language pretty fast. Polish Americans don't speak Polish. Italian Americans really don't speak Italian. My grandparents spoke Yiddish. The languages go. A lot of the old ways go. But the identity gets, in some sense, more and more rigid. But what is that rigidness? I mean, what is it based on? Is it just based on symbols, flags? And often that's the case, that I'm Italian American, or, even I'm African American. What does that identity mean if your lifestyle and plans and hopes are very similar to everyone else's. And it seems to me that is the case. I mean, most people want in on the same thing as everyone else. And, it's sort of a truth that no one wants to admit, I guess. I mean, they don't want to say, yes, we're all so different, but actually we want the same things. We want to drive a BMW and live in a nice neighborhood and go on vacations, to the Mediterranean. I don't know. It's like, well, where's the diversity there? And then you say, well, my music tastes or my food tastes are somewhat different. Oh, okay. Is that it? I mean, that's pretty limited.
Wouldn't the capitalist triumphalist, or maybe the complacent, respond, well, that's because they're good things and everybody should want them. So there we go. What is there to argue about?
Well, okay, exactly. I mean, so yes, capitalism is one. People want the same things. They want iPhones. And again, I say that, who are the people who really are not part of the diversity thing? It's like the Amish, some maybe Hasidic Jews, some very small communities who are very insular and stand apart. And basically, they're never mentioned because they don't want in, they want out. I mean, they don't want to participate. No one says, well, we don't have an Amish representative here. They don't want to be here. Everyone else wants to be here. They all want part of the pie. So, I mean, this seems to be one of the gigantic paradoxes of the diversity ideology. And in this sense, some of the conservative critics are not wrong. I mean, what does it mean to have diversity if everyone agrees? Basically, because intellectual diversity in terms of, any kinds of programs is impossible to tabulate. I mean, you can look up, you can tabulate race, you can tabulate religion, skin color. So we could have that kind of diversity. But what is diversity of ideas? How do you get that? I mean, if we all agree, what's the diversity?
Yeah, market competition everywhere, but in the realm of ideas, I guess that's what's on the table.
Yeah, and that is a conservative critique, which I think is not totally wrong. I mean, there's something to that. Because I mean, we look at, and the other things we can list, we can do spreadsheets, on diversity, in terms of race and religion. The economics is something else which is often left out. I mean, because that again is harder to tabulate. So I mean, I've argued that a long time ago. I mean, some of the universities are much more diverse in terms of their photographs, but actually they're all wealthier. I mean, they're actually, they look very diverse, but if you actually scratch away, they're coming from a very small economic class. Even though, it looks, this is gorgeous. We have Black people, we have Latino people, we have, but if you scratch away, most of them are actually quite wealthy.
Yeah.
And that's,
And so, I mean, in the beginning of the book, you talk about this question of this sort of generational sequence of immigrants, of how third generation immigrants tend to seek out their roots and perform their difference rather than seeking to integrate as their parents and grandparents did. And two thoughts spring to mind. One is whether that is a sort of generational dynamic, that this always happens with third generation immigrants, or whether it's merely the coincidence of that third generation with a historical change, which is that the kind of rise of identity politics and decline of universalist ideologies. What do you think is most operative in that attempt, not just among immigrants, of course, but kind of broadly to kind of go and find your roots, to try to shape your own identity and this sort of these sorts of practices?
Well, I mean, I'd say the short answer is both or all of the above. I mean, on one hand, it has been said that, you know, it's the third generation which feels secure enough in terms of its kind of, this is in terms of the United States, I mean, who feels secure enough as an American citizen that they can begin to identify as, you know, a hyphenated American, as Polish American or Italian American. So it takes a certain success and security to begin to present yourself as something else. But at the same time, yes, I mean, the rise of identity politics and you know, I think I say somewhere it's sort of the opium of the left. You know, in the absence of any vision of the world, we just want more different things. So that you know, that is also part of the story, that we've entered a period where politics, you know, it does shrink to identity politics. I mean, your vision is, you know, based on your identity. And, you know, it's not clear where that leads, except to, yeah, we want more people like ourselves in, you know, fill in the blank, in law schools, in Hollywood, you know, whatever. And, you know, and that's, it's pretty explicit. I mean, that's, I mean, I cite chapter and verse. I mean, like, you know, we want more of our people. And again, it's fair enough on itself, but as a vision, it's pretty, you know, empty. It's, you know, it doesn't offer much more. You know, we want more of ourselves, to give more our voices of ourselves. And what are those voices? I mean, do you offer something? Well, that's not so clear.
Yeah, it's rearranging the carefully allocated chairs on the Titanic, I guess.
Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck when you know, U.S. Americans start doing kind of identity politics talking about the roots or their communities. I always think, my God, you're so American. So that, you know, for all the diversity talk, that it's all quite provincial and samey, that it's all very U.S. American, though increasingly it seems to be kind of global, or at least across the West. I wanted to move on to something that's a central concern of the book on diversity, which is another element which took me a little bit by surprise, because I didn't imagine the book going there. But I think it's rewarding for having done so, is that the question of childhood and the way children are brought up today. So you ask pointedly, does spontaneous play nurture the individual's resources that sustain a liberal democracy? And conversely, does the waning of this play stunt talents essential for everyday citizenship? So you seem to want to answer yes. So what is your thinking here?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is my thinking. I mean, I think that the danger of, and you know, it's sort of a symbol, you know, having strollers with iPad holders on them, you know, suggests that we are, you know, introducing infants to, you know, pre-packaged videos and pre-packaged entertainment, you know, at the earliest ages. So, you know, what does that do to individual resources and imagination? You know, I have a little thing there about, you know, I guess the end of boredom, you know, that growing up, at one point, it was okay to be bored, you know, not having something to do. And, you know, I quote the classic 1950s novel, memoir about where you're going, nowhere, what are you going to do? Nothing. Sort of like, you know, that the notion that kids would just, you know, you just go out and, you know, do nothing. That doesn't happen anymore, or at least it doesn't happen in the same way anymore because of paranoia. Like, okay, if you're doing nothing, that's dangerous. If you're bored, we got to overcome that. And we can overcome it through an iPad, through prefabricated entertainment. So the question is, if play itself, spontaneous play, is now prefabricated, what does this do to the individual, to imagination, to the individual's resources? I raise those questions. Can one talk about the end of boredom, the end of kind of the free space? And again, the difficulty is unraveling nostalgia from reality. I mean, the idea that my parents or that generation would say go out and play. Well, the parents say that anymore. It's too dangerous. Where are you going? What are you doing? Like, just go out and play. Come back for dinner. Whoa, you couldn't do that nowadays. You'd be arrested. Child abandonment. How come your child is wandering around the streets? So does that happen? Again, there's a question of nostalgia there. But I think there is a real movement. I mean, there's a paranoia about leaving children alone at all, that it's dangerous. And when I say children, I'm not talking about 3-year-olds. I'm talking about 8, 9, 10-year-olds. It's dangerous. And we've also filled the spaces. We have the ability to fill those spaces with computers, with iPads, with games. And talk about utopia. I mean, what does that do to imagination? That from the earliest ages, we are constructing, play for children. I mean, that's rather new. I'm wondering if it's dangerous, or not dangerous, but it's certainly damaging to the individual.
Yeah. I mean, I found it, as someone who struggles, or hates being bored, really hates being bored and will do anything to avoid it. I found it compelling, the account you give. On the other hand, there's a skepticism within me which goes, well, there's been the usual hand-wringing and indeed panics around television and then video games and then social media and so on. Why at this stage do we yell stop? What has it reached a tipping point where childhood now is so under assault by advertisers and social media and various forms of entertainment and loads of screen time, that now at this point in history it's too much and childhood is being ruined and it'll have terrible consequences for democracy and everything else in the future, and that this is the point at which we yell stop? And why not in 1975 for that matter, or why not in 2020, 2030 or whatever?
Well, again, it's a good point that I think I raise it myself. I mean, the end of childhood has been announced now for 20 or 30 years. I mean, Neil Postman writes a book about it. I mean, I cite some of these things. I mean, it's not a new notion, but one has to be careful of saying, well, we've heard this before, and so it's not true. I mean, every generation says, introduction of telephones, radios, TVs, internet, are all disastrous. So we've heard this before. I mean, sure, we should be aware. On the other hand, yes, maybe there is a tipping point. Isn't it possible that I mean, the computers and the iPads introduced at an early age do change the individual. And it seems like, I mean, I don't want to cite surveys, but, adolescents, teenagers, they're more anxious and depressed than ever. It seems. I mean,
there was this survey. I mean, this chart circulated quite widely on Twitter a couple of weeks back, showing this very sharp uptick in all these kind of pathologies, really over the past decade. Very sharp uptick in the US, and it is hard to avoid the conclusion that I guess you're getting towards. Yeah.
Yes, that the individual resources are getting so weak. I mean, you see videos of at the earliest age, you see happy people doing glorious things, gorgeous looking, not me. I'm not gorgeous. I'm not doing that, And if you see it from the earliest ages, just you can see it's corrosive. You feel worse and worse. And I think, that the individual resources are dwindling, and the ability to withstand that stuff, which, has to do with growing up, is harder to obtain. And, I think kids and adolescents are more and more vulnerable. And so, yes, it's very possible there's an element of nostalgia there. We used to go out and play and, get lost, come back for dinner. No one says that anymore, at least in the States. You have sports, you have this, you have that, you're regulated. But perhaps there's a price to pay for the individual. I mean, has lost something.
Hello, listener. That's the end of the free part of this interview. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, that's at patreon.com/bungacast. Just to repeat, $5 a month subscribers get access to this, as well as 2 original episodes a month, including extended interviews, original episodes where we analyze present history and ask the deeper questions about current affairs that aren't being asked elsewhere, as well as our engagement with patrons. And for $10, you get access to our reading club. This year, 2023, we are going through freedom, legitimacy, and globalization as the big themes of the year. We hope you will join us for this intellectual exploration, which will hopefully provide us with the tools to break through the impasse known as the end of history. Catch you on the other side.